Since I was born in the elitist Northeast, I've always known people's deep-seated beliefs that the conservative rural Southerners or the automakers of Michigan are just less intelligent than the progressive Northeasterners up here. That's why they vote for the wrong party. It always seemed pretty discriminatory and rude to me, but on this channel I've looked into so many stereotypes and found that there's more truth in them than I first thought, even if they are pretty rude. So are conservatives just plainly less intelligent than progressives? Or is this just a common example of one group comparing themselves to an out-group in a positive manner? Hey guys, I'm your host Dylan, and today I'm going to discuss a topic that you're not allowed to say publicly, but so many up here in my area believe. My goal isn't to say anything about what beliefs are correct, but to simply look at what the facts are. I'll look at what the research, the data, and the statistics have to say, while keeping my biases out as much as possible. First, we'll look into whether this is actually true. Then, if it's true, what social reasons might be at play. Then, any biological reasons that might be at play. Then lastly, if this holds true for all types of people. You'll see what I mean when we get there. But before you can see any of that and get into any of that fun stuff, is there any truth here, or is this just a stereotype that liberals repeat in order to feel superior? Well, the research says that there's something here. 2024 research found that IQ and the person's genetic predisposition towards higher cognitive performance and educational success, basically just a more academic view of IQ, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily better. But these two things were correlated with specific attitudes. The correlation they found was that higher intelligence led to being more socially liberal and less supportive of authoritarian politics. Now, aren't those two touchy things to go together? Meaning that individuals with higher IQ were more likely to support views of social freedom and weak centralized control. Other studies corroborate, as they have found a negative correlation between conservatism and intelligence. Although it's interesting to say, because social freedom and weak centralized control are usually attributed to two different parties here in the States. They even found that this holds true within families. With siblings raised in the same environment, the one with a higher IQ is more likely to be progressive. That's a crucial detail because it controls for upbringing, parents, and environment to a significant degree. And interestingly enough, a group of psychologists did research on political affiliation and its connection to politics and found that the more conservative someone's beliefs are, the lower their IQ is on average. Of course, this doesn't mean that there aren't smart people that are conservative and that there aren't dumb people that are progressive, but as you'll see at the end of this video, there's something interesting about smart people, as you can see on the graph right here. As you can see, generally, as you get more progressive with your politics, the average person you find is going to have a higher IQ, with a difference between very conservative and very liberal being 11 IQ points, which is a significant jump. But it's also interesting to note this connection with religion, with the difference between people being very religious and slightly religious being around 2 IQ points, but with there being a huge spike when you move from slightly religious to not at all. However, not every finding agrees, as one finding from 2014 found that from better verbal skills, your average Republican has an IQ of around 1 to 4 points higher than your average Democrat. Now, it's nothing to write home about because 1 to 4 IQ points makes very little difference, but it's important in going against the commonly held belief that conservatives are less intelligent. But in general, researchers have found more evidence for progressive politics being linked to IQ than for conservative politics being linked to IQ. However, these differences, when found, are not usually profound and world-changing unless you're at the extremes. In most of these works, your average conservative is anywhere between 3 to 7 IQ points lower than your average progressive. But of course, these differences are magnified to the double digits when you look at the two extremes. Now, one thing you shouldn't get into your head before we move on is that just because you're conservative or liberal doesn't mean that you have a low IQ or high IQ. Your IQ is just your IQ, and your beliefs don't actually do anything to change your IQ. It's correlation, not causation. But now let's look at any possible social reasons for this difference. And there's some fun stuff here, let me tell you that. But the most obvious place we have to start is in education. It's well established that progressives attend college at higher rates, as you can see on the graph here, when compared to conservatives. And degree holders favor Democrats by a roughly 13-point margin. That relationship alone shows what most people would think. However, the link between schooling and intelligence isn't nearly as strong or straightforward as many people would assume. Each year of college is associated with a roughly 1 to 5 IQ point increase. But even the word increase is misleading here, as researchers still debate whether college actually increases intelligence, or whether people with higher intelligence are just simply more likely to pursue and complete college. As seen on the graph here, that 1 to 5 point estimate aligns closely with what we know about average IQ by educational attainment. The average person whose highest level of education is high school scores around 90 IQ, while the average graduate or professional degree holder scores around 110 IQ. That's a 20-point difference over approximately 8 years of education, or about 2.5 IQ points per year. So right in the middle of the accepted range. So education probably matters, but of course, there's more to this story. There's also evidence for a more direct psychological relationship. And what's known as the mediation model, research has found a significant association between general intelligence and the likelihood of being socially conservative, authoritarian, and prejudiced. Conservatives don't run on being prejudiced, but their politics lead to higher levels of it. All right, that's just what the study found. Importantly, this doesn't mean intelligence causes political beliefs. Rather, intelligence appears to influence how people process social complexity, ambiguity, and threats. All factors that strongly relate to authoritarian and socially conservative attitudes. I bet certain people in this video are really enjoying what I'm saying so far. But by far the most important variable in this whole discussion is economics. After controlling for parental income, intelligence measured in childhood, roughly ages 5 to 15 in this study, intelligence ends up being a moderate predictor of income in adulthood. In other words, smarter kids tend to earn more later in life. You don't need a video to tell you that though. However, when socioeconomic status is included in the analysis, a much stronger pattern emerges. Children from higher SES families score higher on IQ tests on average, and this gap appears very early in childhood, around grade school. This would make sense because bad economic conditions create chronic stress, which directly harms cognitive performance. Because, as many of us will know, stress impairs memory, attention, and your ability to focus. All of which matters pretty big for IQ tests if you ask me. But the real damage happens earlier. Early childhood, especially ages 0 to 5, is a critical period for brain development. At 2 years old, the average IQ gap between high SES and low SES children is about 6 points. By age 16, that gap has tripled to 18 points. That difference is larger than the average IQ between Ashkenazi Jews and the general population. Yeah, that's a big deal. So when people argue endlessly about small differences between political groups, they often miss the fact that economic conditions in childhood most likely dwarf everything else. And research consistently shows that the following factors in the first 5 years of life play a massive role in determining adult intelligence. Poverty, poor nutrition, lack of access to quality preschool, unstable housing, premature or low birth weight, and low cognitive stimulation. And this raises an obvious question. Why is this being brought up in a conservatives have lower IQ video? Ain't it liberals who bring up all this stuff? Well, here's why it matters. Social conservatives, especially at younger ages, are statistically more likely to grow up experiencing poverty, poor nutrition, limited access to quality preschool, and housing instability. This does not apply nearly as strong to economic conservatism, which disproportionately is supported by higher income and upper class individuals. So the distinction between social and economic conservatism is critical here. And oftentimes when people talk about progressives versus conservatives, it's in this social sphere. However, no serious analysis of this topic is complete without addressing the institutional context of the research itself. It's obviously difficult to fully figure out how big of an impact this has, but the field of social psychology is overwhelmingly progressive. There's no other way to say it. In many academic settings, liberals outnumber conservatives by ratios ranging from 10 to 1 to as high as 30 to 1. That doesn't mean that the research is fraudulent, but with imbalances that large, unconscious bias is almost inevitable. An example for this bias is how psychological research focused heavily on concepts like right-wing authoritarianism with little to no corresponding interest in left-wing authoritarianism. This asymmetry helped create a narrative of conservative cognitive deficiency. This asymmetry may have played a role in creating the narrative so dominant here in the elitist Northeast. And when research parameters are adjusted to include tasks where conservatives tend to perform better, such as those involving structure, persistence, rule following, and inhibitory control, I won't pretend to know what those last two words mean, the intelligence gap often shrinks, becomes task-specific, or disappears entirely. This suggests that part of the story may not be differences in intelligence, but differences in what psychologists choose to measure. So between less schooling, lower income families, being more religious, there are many factors that could be causing the apparent lower IQ among conservatives. However, we can't ignore that when only one type of worldview is present in a field, bias is almost always going to seep right through it. But who wants to learn about all that stuff about social science? Let's just get to the fun part already and look at genetics, race, brain structure, and all that fun stuff that gets people uncomfortable and cancels careers. But I don't really have a career to cancel anyways, so let's get into it. First, we had to start off with genetics, specifically the scary word of polygenic scores. A polygenic score is, in simple terms, the likelihood of a trait for that person. Its most common use is in educational attainment, with a high polygenic score in educational attainment, meaning you are more likely to obtain higher levels of education. It's not a destiny or anything, it's just when levels are higher, if you look at a group average, more people are going to go that way. But importantly for us today, there's been recent research into the polygenic scores between intelligence and politics within the family. In a study looking at 300 biological and adoptive families, they found that polygenic scores for cognitive performance significantly predicted all 6 of the major scales of political belief they use in the study. And specifically, they found siblings with higher polygenic scores were more likely to exhibit social liberalism and lower levels of authoritarianism than their low-scoring siblings. So if you got 2 groups of 100,000 people, one group with high polygenic scores and one with low polygenic scores, the high group would be much more likely to be progressive and the other one conservative. And this is true for all things genetics, with political ideology that someone believes in being attributed to genetic factors at a 50% rate. For what you believe in about politics, half of it has been attributed to something you have no control over. This is important when you consider that IQ is largely affected by genetics, meaning that people with higher IQs are much more likely to have high IQ children and vice versa. Again, you didn't need a video to tell you that. So if you take into account a lot of studies done showing that conservatives, especially the most conservative, have lower IQs than average, that means someone born to 2 very conservative parents is likely to have a lower IQ. The same logic would theoretically hold true for religion as well. But at the same time, do we not all think about kids rebelling against their parents' politics? For example, Gen Z choosing to be religiously unaffiliated at a near 50% rate, even though their parents were Christians at 80% rates? And what about the huge political shifts we've seen across history, with monarchies in France or Germany being overthrown, or near theocracies in Quebec and the Middle East? And well, yeah, researchers have noticed this and found data showing that with the existence of huge political changes in short periods of time to be evidence that environmental factors play a big role. It kind of makes sense. Nowadays, the most intelligent people in the world are usually more progressive versus conservative socially, although that has been changing somewhat, but are nearly always non-religious, or at a minimum, way less certain and less likely to ascribe to religious dogmas. This is the opposite case for elected officials who are much more religious on average than the general public. And just like basically every video I've ever made for this channel, the argument between nature versus nurture is at the center of every serious debate. There's definitely evidence that genes play a big role in who's conservative, and with that being correlated to intelligence, but there's also heavy evidence that environmental factors play an equal, if not a larger, role. One of the most interesting patterns I came across in this research is the huge difference between average voters and the leaders of political movements. Your average conservative and your average progressive are genuinely different people, culturally, economically, and psychologically. But when you look at the leaders of conservatism and progressivism, those differences start to collapse, weirdly enough. People that are more extreme on political issues than the general public. Because political elites tend to come from the same schools, same family backgrounds, same neighborhoods, and as the evidence suggests, they also tend to have similar levels of intelligence regardless of ideology. So just a quick definition of what political elites are. They include elected officials, party leaders, Fortune 500 CEOs, and in general are people who are disproportionately highly educated, politically knowledgeable, and embedded in elite professional and institutional networks. And compared to your average voter, political elites show several consistent differences. They hold more ideologically consistent views, with your average voter not making sense if you really look at all their views. They're more engaged and informed about politics, with your average voter just seeing headlines once in a while or looking on X every now and again. They're less representative of their party's mass base, as elites have much more similar experiences than they do to their base. And despite leading opposite coalitions, political elites often share more life experiences with each other than they do with the voters they represent. This elite public gap has been documented directly in political science research, showing that elite opinions frequently diverge of the general public within the same party. A study comparing the big five personality traits of politicians and the general public found that politicians across both parties, I'd like to add, tend to be more extroverted, more agreeable, more emotionally stable, and more conscientious. Interestingly, even though both parties' representatives had elite schooling at a level far higher than your average voter, progressives tend to view elite educated politicians as more competent, while conservatives often view elite education as being a sign of the deep state, with conservatives having much worse views of collegiate institutions as being positive compared to progressives, as you can see on the graph here, except for sports. They like that. A nice little bit here that at the end is the number of current conservative commentators like Ben Shapiro, whose big story is how they left the left, used to be progressives but then became conservative, showing just another way the elites are more similar. And regardless of whether every individual claim is true, the pattern itself is revealing. It highlights just how often political elites move fluidly between ideological camps, reinforcing the idea that the elite political conflict is often more performative than it is fundamental. At the top, the divide isn't nearly as wide as it looks from the bottom, or as it looks by looking at bipartisan voting, the myth itself. So basically, conservatives might be less intelligent than progressives, but we can't say with 100% certainty. But with lower economics, being more religious, and many more, there definitely is evidence for it. Nonetheless, whoever you vote for in November was likely raised in a similar style and experience as your enemy. So yeah, just think about that the next time you vote. I touched on this a little bit in the middle of the video, but politics isn't the only thing that correlates with IQ. There's also race. And while it wasn't an uncomfortable video to research, script, and record and all of that, I'll tell you what, it certainly taught me a few things and had some takeaways that were pretty surprising. You can see that video right here. And don't forget to be super progressive for intelligence, be rich and have parents that care about you, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.